So I think it certainly may be necessary to restrain some people. But I find that the way in which Bob Murphy talks about pretty much the same thing in chaos theory is a little more appealing. Murphy suggests that people's movements would be restricted because very few people might be willing to provide bonds or insurance for those with histories of serious violent conduct, and without bonds or insurance they might not be allowed to go very many places. Perhaps many insurance companies would insure them only if they were willing to live under supervised conditions. I think that certainly makes sense. It doesn't feel quite so much like the sort of slave contract that I fear the Tannehills come close to talking about. I think they work hard not to say that. But they do tilt in that direction, and certainly I think cross the line when they talk about the involuntary sale of people's services to mental health professionals for experimentation. I think this is quite troubling, and I think it's probably a little naive to suppose that the mental health professionals would be quite as well-intentioned as the Tannehills envisioned. I'm just not sure anybody has the right to do this, and I would suggest that the best remedy, the best way of avoiding this kind of problem in the legal system of the stateless society is to take Spooner's view, which I mentioned before, that the creditor is entitled to whatever the debtor has when the debt comes due, not to some indefinite stream of income at another time. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, if you take Spooner's view, that people get off scot-free. Why would they not get off scot-free? Well, clearly there would be penalties. It would be hard for people to get insurance if they just abandoned their debt obligations, and clearly it would be very hard for them to secure other kinds of loans. And for both of those reasons, they might well have good reason to keep paying on debts after the time the debt came due, but there wouldn't be the opportunity to legally enforce those if a view like Spooner's was in place. The Tannehills consider a possible case as an objection to their view. They consider a case in which somebody opted for thefts so petty that the recoverable amount would be smaller than the cost of recovering it, thus making prosecution of the case economically unfeasible. And in that case, they suggest someone could get away with a career of aggression of sorts. But the reality is that this is certainly true today as well, right? I mean, there's always the issue of prosecutorial discretion, and prosecutors are not going to spend a lot of time pursuing bubblegum thefts in a system that's state-based. Many of you, I'm sure, will have seen The Big Lebowski, one of my favorite movies. And of course, one thing that happens in that movie is that the dude's car is stolen, and he believes that $1 million is in the trunk, and so it's quite important for him to get the car back. And so he's really delighted when he gets a call from the police and he's told that his car is at an impound yard. And so he heads down to the impound yard and he discovers that the car's there, but several other things are missing, including the briefcase. And this is a car that looks like a hunk of junk that nobody would want. And so he says to the cop whom he's talking to at the impound yard, is anything happening to catch the people who did this? And so the cop says to him, oh yeah, we got 3 or 4 guys working on this full time at the crime lab right now. And of course we're supposed to laugh because nobody's going to be working full time at a crime lab on figuring out who stole a car that's worth $800. It's just not a priority. And so I think it's unrealistic to assume that the bubblegum thief is going to be any better off or in a stateless environment than today. The reality is most of the time the bubblegum thief is going to be ignored in the stateless environment unless that person is caught right at the moment of committing the aggressive act. I think we just have to recognize that there are finite resources that any legal system has. So I don't think there's any reason to think that there's a huge difference in terms of how this kind of case would be handled now as opposed to a stateless society. Now, it's also a mistake because the cost of recovery would be among the bits of compensation that one could reasonably gain. I mean, if you're going to make people whole, then it can't just be the case that you return what they've lost. directly what's been taken by an unjust aggressor, but also the cost of getting that back from the unjust aggressor has to be included. And so if somebody really wanted to spend time and money getting the bubble gum back, that certainly would be an option. And it's not the case that the bubble gum thief would get away with everything. Now, obviously, people would have to gamble that they could find the person and could convict him or her, but I don't think that's impossible. In any event, apart from the image of rectification companies, which I do find quite troubling, the overall image in these chapters is very positive and appealing. I think these chapters represent the Tannehills at their best. It's hard to imagine the writers of these words as former members of the Minutemen or of the American Nazi Party. Instead, these are people here who are talking about a compassionate, humane social order in which people wouldn't be subjected to the horrors of prison and of the justice system, but in fact would compensate each other for harms and move on. And I think that's a very appealing vision of what life would be like in a society marked by the kind of peaceful cooperation we're focusing on here in this class.